So you guys getting some bonus content. We are getting some bonus content. So let's introduce our guests. We have Q, and then we have also your friend Hassan.
What's up?
Welcome to Revolutionary Blackout Network. We know each other for a while. It's finally good to finally have this conversation on Revolutionary Blackout. But before we get started, Q is a great writer, podcaster, does a show with Glenn Greenwald on Call In. He also got a great YouTube channel as well. As a way to get this conversation started, can you want to introduce yourself, Q, and your work and kind of your political perspective and why you got into commentary, just so our audience have a good idea who we're talking to?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Q Anthony Omene, and I began as a columnist. Wrote for a number of publications. I've written for Maclean's Magazine, National Post, Vice, Washington Post. American Prospect, The Independent, Guardian. All over the place. And most of what I wrote had to do with politics and the intersection of race, politics, and culture. And I guess as I began to develop more and more revolutionary politics, and as I began to become much more comfortable with the idea of openly stating and professing those politics, obviously some of those media opportunities dried up, which was completely fine by me, because frankly, I'm much more here to help people understand revolutionary history, to propagate socialism, to talk about the issues that are the most important, I think, of our time. And if you're not applying dialectical materialism, if you're not applying historical materialism, if you're not looking at the problems that we're facing right now through a communist lens, then I really have no idea what it is that you're doing. So that's why I'm here.
I think, like you said, if you would just keep your head down, stay the capitalist, you'd probably be at the Washington Post or New York Times, right? So
well, no. Just to be fair, I mean, I had already I was openly a communist before I even wrote any columns at the Washington Post or with Maclean's and so on. It's just that I think some of the contradictions that we've encountered, and some of the topics, especially with regards to geopolitics, where a lot of newspapers, magazines, publications want you to take a certain line. Unfortunately, I'm just not willing to do that. Two big problems that I had was explaining why, even though there might be, let's say, civil rights or even human rights abuses in Xinjiang, China, I was not willing to go along with the idea that there was a genocide, because once you look into all the available evidence, even if you're looking into what's available in the English language, never mind sources that are available in Mandarin Chinese, you find out that it's all bullshit. It doesn't stack up. And also where it came to so that was bad enough. Like when I would say, for example, people would ask me what I thought of the China-Taiwan issue, if I'm so contrarian about Xinjiang, and I would say, well, Taiwan is a part of China, and the United States recognizes that. If you want to personally not recognize it, you can do whatever you want, but your own government recognizes that Taiwan is China. That Canada recognizes Taiwan as China. I'm not really sure why we're disagreeing on this. And also in the issue of Hong Kong, people would ask why I'm not standing with the comrades in Hong Kong. I'm like, they're not comrades of mine. They're
What was your?
They're
I would love to hear. What was your biggest criticism? Because I was talking about this issue as well, and we go.
Well, I mean, just to get to the breaking point, the absolute breaking point was when Russia launched their, as they say, a special operation in Ukraine, and I explained to people that this isn't an unprovoked attack. Russia has been under attack since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There's been a consistent attempt to destroy the Russian Federation. Now it gets off in fits and starts, but I think in many cases, the U.S. and NATO broadly don't expect their enemies to survive. And so for China to not only survive, but become the largest world power, the most well-developed world power, I think it's an affront to them, both on an economic and hegemonic level, and I think also on a deep-seated racist level. I think there's just a lot of people in the United States that cannot stand the idea of China having its own sphere of influence. And then when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine fiasco, you have so many liberals that they've been in this revanchist fantasy since 2016, when they believe that Russia stole an election on Donald Trump's behalf. And it doesn't matter how much blood they have to spill. They're willing to like risk the future of the earth. Like they're willing to risk it all in a nuclear exchange just so that they can get back at the bad orange man. And frankly, when I would explain to people, like, no, Putin, I mean, granted, you can have your opinions of him. I certainly have mine, but he's not like an illogical actor. He's not a megalomaniac. He's not a madman. There are very logical reasons why Russia is engaged. The Russian Federation is engaging in this operation, and not the least of which, people talk about like the Nazi problem in Ukraine, and you can do that. I think you're probably selling the problem way short when you do that. It's not just the Nazi problem. It's also NATO encirclement of Russia. It's also the people of the DPR and the LPR, as we call them now, that have been under constant bombardment, that have had human rights atrocities committed against them by the Eastern Ukrainian armed forces. It's the fact that Ukraine, being one of the most corrupt countries on earth, was literally siphoning natural resources that were being delivered through its territory by Russia into Central and Western Europe. It was the fact that Russia was building a gas pipeline to go around Ukraine to stop them from siphoning off gas, and attempting to sabotage it by accusing these countries of collaborating with Russia. So this idea of like trying to wall off Russia and economically segregate it from the rest of the world, I mean, this on top of the military threat, it's sitting right in their backyard. The U.S. conducting these biological experiments, as they've been saying for years. All of these things have been happening not since 2014, but since 1991. Yes. So if you think that Vladimir Putin is attacking unprovoked, I just have to question whether you even perceive reality. And those are the reasons why I have a hard time getting my byline splits anymore, because I'm not known to bullshit people.
Yeah, I was just about to say that that you guys just heard is exactly why you're not going to see a Q feature at Washington Post and New York Times, because a lot of those things you just heard, you never will see them report. And I want you to hold that thought, because I want to ask you what the U.S. left that we harshly criticize on this show. All the elected progressives voted to get $40 billion in Ukraine, and you got so many people who consider themselves on the left who still support them after doing that. I want to get your take on that, Q, but hold that thought. I want to get Hassan in here and give him a proper introduction as well. I'm not too familiar with you as well, but I know if you hanging around Q, this is going to be a good conversation. So do you want to start off by introducing yourself, kind of your politics, and how you got started in working in the industry? Go ahead. Check your audio, by the way. I think you might be muted as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, man. I'm a co-host with Q on the Kulture. Myself, I'm a scientist professionally, but my research and work is in Marxism and Leninism. I'm a Marxist-Leninist. I just wanted to add a few more thoughts to what Q was saying.
Yeah, feel free.
So the way I like to frame it is not that Russia attacked, or is that Russia had a reason to attack. For me, it's a widening of the battlefield. As a Marxist, I like to view international politics as like one large world system, right? So to me, all that happened is that the battlefield widened. This battle has been going on, this war has been going on, and it's a struggle between imperialism and all other nations that are oppressed by imperialism. Now, when we talk about Ukraine and Russia, I like to keep it on a theoretical level, because even if you talk about facts, all the propagandists will they'll be like, source, proof, they literally think that Russia is being defeated right now. They think that Russia is running out of bullets. They think that Putin has cancer, and this is the level that they're operating at. So you can't even come to them with facts, right? You can't talk about the coup in 2014, the Nazi coup. You can't talk about how protesters who were protesting the coup were fired in by the state, because these propagandists were like, is there evidence that they were fired in? Actually, the people who were shooting were the protesters, right? Like it's very difficult to argue on this empirical level. And again, since I'm a Marxist, I don't operate on with empiricism. I operate through dialectics. So I really want to give you a picture of the Marxist view of imperialism. So imperialism is a stage of capitalism in which monopoly finance capital ends up dominating, right? You no longer have this free competition between small capitalists inside a country. You have a monopoly process that conglomerates all capitalists together in a country, and then beyond the borders of those countries across the world. And not only that, there's then a merging of manufacturing capital with finance capital. And finance and speculation ends up dominating. So, long story short, the enemy doesn't become the boss who's directly right above you. The enemy becomes this international conglomerate of finance capital. Some people will call them the globalists. Some people will call them the new liberals. Whatever you want to name them, we call them the imperialists. Now, who's on the other side? On the other side, you have all kinds of people. You have socialist countries. You have capitalist countries who are not part of the world financial monopoly system, right? And you have countries undergoing decolonization. You have countries like India who, may want to be the new imperialist power. The point is, you have all kinds of different forces that are struggling against imperialism, and Russia falls right in with them. For me, Russia's invasion was a very positive thing in history. For the first time, a superpower since the fall of the Soviet Union militarily challenged the imperialists. The imperialists can no longer walk around doing whatever they want. We saw a similar kind of event happen last summer in Palestine, with the increase of attacks in May upon the Gaza Strip. What happened? The Israelis attacked, and then they were met with rocket fire in response. This is what's called a new line of demarcation, or crossing the red line. And I like to say that the same thing happened in Russia. The imperialists crossed the red line, and Putin, who had clearly defined that red line since 2008 even, responded in a way that he said he would, right? So this is a very important thing. The imperialists, for a long time, for decades now, have gotten away with just doing whatever they wanted. Even if people make threats, even if people say, hey, we don't want you doing this, the U.S. will cross that line anyway, and they aren't really faced with that many repercussions. So for me, not only is the Russian attack a broadening of the battlefield, but it's also stating very firmly that you cross this red line, you will face consequences. And now the imperialists are really struggling with this fact that they were actually met with consequences.
Yeah, and when we've been covering this issue, you guys brought up a lot of great things, because a lot of the liberal class and progressive class, they purposely misreport this crisis, where they pretend that this crisis started as soon as Putin crossed the border and they invaded. I love how you guys bring up how this is a war that was going on for a while, like since at least 2014. I've seen people make arguments that it's been a proxy war longer than that. So in my position, especially as someone who considers myself a Marxist, Leninist, anti-imperialist, as well, is that NATO is an organization that must be opposed. We must call for the abolition of NATO, because NATO is a structure, is an organization that serves the imperialist economic order, as you described, like Lenin described. Imperialism is the giant economic order that we must oppose. And there's so many people who are kind of like, they like rab libs, they pretend to be progressives, and they just use buzzwords like, oh, we gotta resist Russian imperialism. So I guess I can pose a question to both of you guys. You got to take a chat. I'm kind of playing devil's advocate, because earlier, Hassan, you said Russia invading Ukraine is a good thing. What would you say to people who say, oh my God, you are cheering on Russian imperialism? And then Q, you can take that question on after him. How will you guys address that if someone would say something like that?
Well,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Hassan.
So again, I already kind of explained my perspective of what imperialism actually is, right? It's this domination of international finance capital. Russia wanted to be part of the imperialist system. The West rejected them. And the reason, my reasoning for that is, you have to really take a step back and look at Eurasia. So when I say Eurasia, I mean, all the land that modern day Russia encompasses. They have a very interesting identity, right? They're not really European. They're also not really Asian. They're kind of like their own entity, Eurasia. So I like to take a step back. Eurasia is something that the Western European forces have always looked towards. And why is that? China. China has always been a great threat to Europe, the Europeans. Even if you look back at the days of European colonialism, before the US was even established, China was a civilization that was thriving. Both economically, politically, it was like a thriving civilization while the Europeans were in dark ages. China was always like this country that was to be envied by the Europeans. So as European colonial powers were getting stronger, they wanted to find a way through China, right? One way is to go through the Eurasian landmass, conquer what's east to them, and work their way into China. But as their mercantile and shipbuilding and naval powers were getting stronger, they decided to sail west and see if they can go around to China, right? But what happened? They ended up hitting the Americas and discovering America. So all of the kind of strategy and focus that was set on Eurasia suddenly got shifted into the Americas. And arguably, Eurasia didn't face a long period of colonialism because the Western European powers were so focused on the Americas since the discovery. Now, so at the same time, something progressive happened in Eurasia, right? Eurasia was not unified under one civilization, under one national unity, until the Tsarist empire kind of appeared. And Samir Amin, who's a Marxist historian and economist, he argues that even the emergence of the Russian Empire under the Tsar was a progressive thing, because unifying all of Eurasia into one national identity was a defensive mechanism against the Western European powers, right? It's very easy to conquer different groups of people, different ethnic groups, different tribes, but it's very different to kind of go in and try to take over one large nationally unified civilization. The other interesting thing about the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union, by the way, the Soviet Union saw the Tsar as bad, as negative, right? But if you look at the Tsar and the Russian Empire from a world historical stage, it's a progressive development in the history of Eurasia. Now, of course, the Soviet Revolution turned the Tsarist empire into a more progressive Russian state run by the people. And something very interesting happened is that all of the different ethnic groups and nationalities that were unified under a centralized Russian identity, they had a net transfer of wealth gained, meaning that the kind of center Russian state transferred wealth into the other smaller national identities, resulting in a positive economic development for them. Now compare that to British colonialism, for example. When the British Empire had control over India, massive amounts of wealth was transferred out of India into the pockets of the European ruling class. While the reverse happened, same thing with China, right? There's a larger transfer of wealth from these parts of China that are ruled occupied by, I don't say the word occupied, that are contained by the Han identity into Tibet or Xinjiang, or other smaller national minorities, right? There's a transfer of wealth outwards for the development. So for me, I like to keep this larger picture in mind. Now, if you go to present day today, the Western European powers are still trying to take over Eurasia. They still see Russia as a pathway into China. And if you heard Kissinger's speech in the World Economic Forum last week, he was talking about how the West needs to stop attacking Russia and turn it back a little bit, because the main focus is China. And even he admits that
they didn't like that. Even him saying that, they was like, "Oh my God, look! If you guys listen to Kissinger now, he like that was Hillary Clinton's mentor. Now that he says one thing right, you guys are complaining." So go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, Kissinger is one of the ruling class's long-term pragmatic planner, right? He doesn't think short-term, he thinks long-term. And for him, China is still kind of the final goal. And he said that all of this attack on Russia is putting Russia and China, are bringing Russia and China closer and closer. So to him, that's a bad thing, right? But you still see today that whether it's a ruling class that wants to be aggressive on Russia, or if it's part of the ruling class that says, hey, let's back off Russia because we need to focus on China, to them, the Eurasian land is still a means into China, right? Yeah. It's still a political tool to get to China.
Yeah, if you look at U.S. strategy, I think they've been successful because their strategy is just enriching arms dealers. That's at the end of it, that's always their job. They're not actually here to achieve geopolitical objectives. But if their geopolitical objective is full spectrum dominance, which is the complete domination of our culture, their actions have been counterproductive, like the Summit of Americas, which has been a disaster. You had Iran and Venezuela; they just signed a 10-year cooperation agreement. You see U.S. hegemony being weakened.
Yeah.
But I also want to get Q in on this question about Ukraine. If someone were to say, "Oh, we gotta support the Ukrainians because what Russia is doing is an act of imperialist aggression. How will you like approach someone who had that belief? And what do you think is the biggest thing that many progressives who fallen for the Ukraine psyop and propaganda? What do you think they get wrong? What do you think the progressives who are voting for 40 billion in Ukraine, these more boutique left, giant progressive channels who are repeating CIA and Zelensky propaganda, what are they getting wrong? Q, you want to take that?
God damn, where do you want me to start with that, bro? You just throw no fucking kitchen sink at me. Okay, let's start with the idea that Russia's imperialist, right? I think, I would really have to withhold my impulse to just say, like, are you on crack? And ask, what do you think imperialism is? Like, what qualifies to you as imperialism? And I think a lot of people they make the mistake and they get confused and they think that imperialism is when you wage war on a country. That's not what imperialism is. Imperialism, a lot of people will do this thing where they will make parallels from the United States' imperialist adventures abroad, especially in Iraq. Like that's probably, the top example in recent history, and claim that Russia is doing the same thing. Except Russia did not venture into Ukraine out of a desire to control Ukraine's natural resources, to exploit its land, to exploit its labor, to extend its sphere of hegemony. Now, there's a difference between hegemony and influence. Influence is something that China exercises in Central and East Asia and in the South Pacific. That is not the same thing as hegemony. Hegemony is, and you can read Gramsci on this, if you want to double check me. Hegemony is when your use of violence has become so efficient and so ingrained, you no longer even have to use violence. Hegemony is when hegemony is when I am very clear that there are certain things that I'm not allowed to say on the stream, otherwise I may get a visit from CSIS. There are things that I'm not allowed to say. There's things that I'm not allowed to say because it may get you struck off of YouTube. And we know this because people have been, in many instances, for telling the truth about what's happening in this conflict, removed from YouTube, removed from Twitter. That's hegemony, where the ruling class ideology no longer has to be enforced by violence, but it is simply something that people self-censor themselves into doing, or there are volunteers, free cops, that will get you out of the paint if you say these things. That's hegemony. Influence is whether by economic or military means that you're able to achieve what you want out of your relationship with another country. It doesn't have to be done by force. It could be done by diplomacy, could be done by arms. Who knows? Now, what people are doing when it comes to this Russia-Ukraine conflict is conflating all of the above and saying that Russia not only has no right to inflict its hegemony on Ukraine, which is true, countries should not inflict their hegemony on other countries, but they have no right to exercise influence over Ukraine, which is absolutely preposterous. You should always be willing to influence your neighbors in order to further your own economic interests, in order to further your own political interests. That's not the same thing as going to another country halfway across the world, destroying its government, overthrowing its government, killing its people, subjecting them to some of the most horrendous human conditions that they've ever experienced, taking them from a fairly, whether you want to say that they're politically developed, Iraq was politically developed prior to the U.S. invasion, I'll leave that one up to your audience, but to take them from a fairly well technologically developed society to one where people couldn't even get clean drinking water, to destroy their infrastructure, to destroy their history and their culture, i.e. allow wanton looting out of their museums, like just completely fucking plundering this country. And then on top of that, placing the American military in charge of their governmental affairs, and then the American military then selects people out of the political class that will further U.S. interests. And on top of all that, they're stealing the oil out from underneath the feet of Iraqis. That is imperialism. It is when you've completely subsumed the will and self-determination of another people into your own. That is not what's happened with Russia-Ukraine. What's happened with Russia-Ukraine is that there is a legitimate military, political, and geopolitical conflict that Russia feels that its own sovereignty is being encroached on by a league of other nations and they're dumping all of their energies and efforts into turning this one nation against them because it is a very strategically important country. There's a reason why Ukraine has at various fits and starts been incorporated into the Russian Federation or into Russia, Imperial Russia, and then been out of it. But it has been a part of the USSR and previously had been part of Imperial Russia for decades, if not over 100 years prior to that. So to act as if there was no prior existing relationship between the two, to act as if I would say like the concessions, if not outright giveaways that happened underneath the USSR to add to the territory of Ukraine, to incorporate Ukraine broadly into the military strategy and the military geography of the USSR, making it a central part, i.e. the Black Sea Fleet being stationed right off the Crimean Peninsula. I mean, there was a togetherness that existed during the USSR years between Ukraine, Russia, and the remainder of the USSR states. The USSR was just, Ukraine was one of the most strategically important and one of the most powerful. To act as if all of that history doesn't exist, to me is ridiculous. So when people say things like Russia is engaging in imperialism, it tells me that you don't really know what imperialism is. These are just buzzwords to you. And if you don't know these facts, like if anything that I've just said in the last couple of minutes is either unfamiliar to you or you're rejecting it outright, it tells me that you either want to remain ignorant or you hope that others will remain in their ignorance. Because these are all true things that actually did happen.
Even the ruling class started using the word imperialism, so it's lost its meaning.
Yeah,
exactly.
We discovered how the ruling class they would take our terms, use it wrong on purpose to destroy the meaning and defang the movement itself, and then they would use it to serve its own objective. That's exactly what they have been doing with the Ukraine crisis. And I promise you guys, I'm not building up a straw man. This is what been driving us crazy at RBN. And the people who have clout on the left, there are a lot of people who have, whether you agree or not, they just got progressive clout. Like Kyle Kalinske, one of the people that said Russia invading Ukraine is literally just as bad as Bush invading Iraq. Which is why I'm glad you brought that up. You brought the Iraq War, because that's literally the messaging that you get from one of the most influencing progressive minds in the United States left. And I know me and Q, we were speaking about this before, and this has been a frustration a lot of our viewers have. People are like, why are you guys calling all these people out? Because they're leading the United States left off the cliff. And we talked about this before off camera, Q, like your frustrations with the United States left, because I honestly do believe the working class being crushed, obviously big
capitalism. The United States has one of the most dysgenic and dysfunctional left.
I'm so excited to talk about the left.
Wings.
Yeah, let's get it.
The entire world.
Let's get it. I would love to hear, because we talk about criticism of the left all the time. Let's start with Q, then let's go to Hassan. Like, why do you think and I'll make it very vague, and then you guys can dive into your criticism. So let's start with this. Why do you guys think the left in the United States is weak? And what do a lot of people who consider themselves progressive get wrong? Very vague. I will get to you guys' criticism. So can you go ahead, and then we get to Hassan after that.
I think you have to begin with the new left movement. It's people talk about, like, Communist Party USA being infiltrated by feds. People talk about, like, COINTELPRO and yada yada yada. But the where you can actually stick a pin in it and start to see a divergence from principled left organizing, agitation, agitprop, and means it, like, attempts to seize political power. That all begins to dissipate when you look into the new left movement. So these ideas that left politics can be achieved independent of communism, where where ruling class organizations, and we're talking about the feds here, but they're not the only one. This, academia was heavily involved in it. The entertainment industry was involved in it. Plus, there was, like, the several scatterings and cadres of, left organizations that were involved in this as well. One of the I would say, like, the most like one of the most damaging of them was the Weather Underground. The Weather Underground, I think, many people in the FBI and the infiltrators were actually trying to influence left organizers during the 1960s, because if you had a bunch of fucking yahoos and maniacs that wanted to, like, bomb buildings and engage in, like, open dialogue on terrorism, then people would be so turned off by that they would think, okay, so if this is what communism means, then count me out. I want nothing to do with it whatsoever. That's why Nobody wanted anything to do with these people, and also why many of the people that were involved in the Weather Underground ended up becoming like academics later on in life, you know, and also ended up diluting their politics. I also hate to say this, but there are people who got involved in left organizing that were highly celebrated revolutionaries, who eventually ended up becoming wreckers and sold their movements out. I will say it, and it's taken me a very long to come to grips with being able to say this publicly, but whatever the fuck, Angela Davis, well-known wrecker in political movements, who ended up not so much disavowing communism as evolving, or I'm not exactly sure what you want to call it, and then moving upwards into academia. So when you see people start leaving ground level political movements and heading up into academia and thought leadership, that should be your immediate red flag that whatever kind of politics they're espousing is not for people, it is for a particular class of people. To bring it back to Gramsci, if you should be well aware that intellectuals exist. You should also be well aware that intellectuals are not always going to be on your side. Now, is that a knock against intellectualism? No, absolutely not. But there are organic intellectuals that spring from the working class for the benefit of the working class. And then there are intellectuals that are manufactured for the purpose of serving the ruling class. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems we have in the quote unquote left is that we cannot determine who are intellectuals operating on behalf of the bourgeoisie and who are intellectuals operating on behalf of the working class. If you listen to an intellectual talk to you about revolutionary politics, and what they're talking about is you would need like a thesaurus or, you know, introduction to like grad school to understand what the fuck they're talking about, they're probably not working on behalf of the working class because nobody talks like that. And where a lot of these movements end up is getting into like fringe issues that benefit only a few people and oftentimes more well-off people. So for example, all of the academics during the 2020 uprising that were trying to convince readers, whether it's like in Slate or Salon.com or wherever the hell, Atlantic, that they ought to be concerned about how well-off Black people are being treated in corporate workplaces, that people are looking at Black academics funny, that they don't get opportunities within their universities, that Black executives board airplanes, get into their seat in the first class section, and people act like they're not supposed to be there. Like, if you're having conversations in the context of an uprising that came about because of the police brutality and murder of working class Black people, but then you're talking about the concerns of academics and executives, then you know that this is being co-opted. So to answer your question, what are my criticisms of modern day left? I think a complete lack of discipline and a complete lack of discernment to understand whether the people that they're supporting, are they on your side or not? And these things that you support, did this come into your head? Did it spring forth from like the mind of Jupiter? Did it arrive to you like a message in a bottle, or did you watch it on CNN or MSNBC? Did you read it in the New York Times or in the Atlantic? Because if you're talking about, for example, Xinjiang, and you're sending people to links that are supported by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute or by organizations that are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, you have no discernment. You could have a complete lack of discernment. But it's almost like they don't even care where they're getting this information from. They just like being right. And if somebody explains things to them in a way that doesn't make them feel good, that doesn't reaffirm their feelings, that isn't "I see you, I hear you," if they're just giving the information to you direct and raw. I'm thinking about, for example, the way that Comrade Camila Escalante will talk to people in the United States about their chauvinistic bullshit with regards to Latin America. And people want to cancel Camila because she's not very nice. Well, fuck you. She actually lives in Latin America, right? She lives in Bolivia. She's seen all of this shit firsthand while you watched it on MSNBC and we're arguing about whether a coup is happening or not. So I think one of the biggest problems I have is like that lack of discernment and that lack of maturity to fucking like suck it up and grow up. Not everyone's going to be nice to you, and you don't have to get along with everybody in order to have a movement. You simply commit yourself to principles and you get shit done.
Yeah, that's the civility politics and tone policing that so many people on the left fall for. And I want to pass it to Hassan because I'm interested in your critique as well. But this is something I noticed as well, especially when I saw Savvy's interview with Adolph Reed, there are a lot of these academics who they sound really left, but then when asked about like solutions, that their answers always turn to bourgeoisie. They were like, "Yeah, the U.S. empire is evil. Capitalism is crushing the workers. Okay, what should we do about? I don't know, maybe vote Democrat." Like that's what they do. But I would love to hear your thoughts, Hassan, because
I'm glad you brought that up because that's exactly what I'm going to start off with. So I have a laundry list of critique.
Yeah,
but first I want to talk about this. Like, you know, if someone asks what should we do, they'll yell at you, go and organize. What does that mean? If you ask for an example, they can't answer, right? So for me, I'm a Marxist, and Marxism is very scientific. You know, it follows the same model as science. You have a hypothesis, you do an experiment, and you check the results. So you come up with a political strategy, you implement it, and then you review it. So I have my ideas on what needs to be done. Q may have his ideas on what needs to be done. You know, we may have different ideas, but all I'm asking for the left to do is to seriously and honestly review what they've been doing for the past like 20 years. Is like, you know, so I see leftism as the complete opposite of populism. Populism tries to build a mass movement. Leftism tries to make this very pure, like tiny group of revolutionaries who everyone hates, right? It doesn't lead to a revolution. So, you know, if the goal is to build political power, right? First of all, how do you do that? And we need to seriously look at what leftists have been doing. Is protesting building political power? I mean, nowadays, if a protest is going on, you know, I live in the city, I'm going to walk by, like, oh, there's a protest going on. I'm going to keep walking by. It's not going to do anything. Mutual aid. You know, you're giving out food, you're handing out some pamphlets with the food. That's not building political power. And the results show, like, what mutual aid group that has been operating in the past few years has grown. Most of them have shrunk, right? It's also like almost like offensive. It's like, hey, if we give you food, will you, you know, join my fringe political ideology? Like, that's not how you build the movement. I could give you a concrete example. You know, some Maoists in Ireland took over this building, this abandoned building, and they wanted to turn it into a homeless shelter, right? So the whole message of the action was end homelessness now. We're taking over this building and we're giving it to homeless people. First of all, you know, squatting isn't like new to homeless people. They've been doing it already. They don't need like a bunch of leftists coming in and saying, hey, we're going to capture this building for you. Second of all, when you're doing an action that will necessarily lead to arrest, that's not building anything. All it's doing is getting your badge of, hey, I've been arrested, so I'm a valid revolutionary. And second, and this is the most important, I think, currently, I mean, so the political establishment to us is not legitimate, right? The bourgeois democracy to us, maybe many of the viewers here, is not legitimate, right? But to most Americans, that democratic establishment is still legitimate in their eyes. So the first thing you need to do is materially show them that it's not legitimate. And it's not going to happen by you yelling on a mic and saying, hey, you know, don't trust the government, destroy the US. That's not how you do it. So, you know, if you want to build political power, you need to operate politics at the level of most people. Most people do not want to participate in a farming co-op and separate themselves from the government and their jobs and feed themselves like that, right? The way most people see politics is, I'm going to vote for someone to stand up for me and let them do it, right? They still see the political process in the hands of others. So it's the job of a communist party now to, first of all, offer a significantly different position, you know, not do what CPUSA does and tail the Democrats, or not do what DSA does and like tail the Democrats, is to offer a new position, offer real policies that make sense to people. And I'm talking about real policy. The policy can't be, you know, abolish prisons. That doesn't make sense to people. A policy needs to be something that actually makes sense to people's lives, so they have reason to vote for them. 30% of Americans right now are not voting, and probably will grow this election because most Americans don't see either party as legitimate, but they still see the kind of democratic establishment as legitimate. Like, right? Like, just because they don't see a party as legitimate doesn't mean they still have lost faith in the whole system. Now, a communist party can help accelerate that. A communist party can come forward with real policies that make sense to people, get people to vote for them, and then show people that, all right, even if a party does represent you, even if a party is not corrupt, it's still not going to work in this political establishment. And that's how you accelerate politics. This is exactly what happened in the Soviet Revolution, right? Lenin wasn't going around like leftists today saying, hey, fuck voting. We're not going to participate in the parliament. We're going to do our own thing. That's not what happened. They participated in the parliament, right? Until the legitimacy of that parliament was lost. And then they were able to move forward to the next stage of evolution. But the point is, we need to, first of all, get people to at least connect with us and like us, not like get people to hate us, because most leftists right now end up getting most people, the average American, to hate them, whether it's through like this cancer culture stuff or being extremely pure with politics, not wanting to talk to someone because they're not ideologically pure. That's already limiting like who you can build with. Second, they're not proposing any alternatives. What are the biggest problems right now? Inflation. For example, inflation is a big problem. What leftists can give you a solution to inflation, like an actual policy that can be implemented right now? Now, this policy, obviously, a policy like that wouldn't be allowed to be implemented, but we can at least come up with a policy that actually makes sense, that is reasonable and fair. For example, China has a lot of, U.S. is in a lot of debt to China. Chinese banks hold a lot of U.S. capital. What would immediately help inflation is if the U.S. government said, hey, we'll back off Taiwan, we'll back off Hong Kong if you just, destroy all this capital sitting in your bank. That would immediately help inflation, and it would immediately help acceleration towards war. A communist party can propose a strategy like that, or it doesn't even have to be a communist party. It could be, a third party coalition. Like they can propose a strategy like that, a strategy that makes sense to people and directly addresses people's concerns. But leftists right now don't operate that way, right? If you ask them what should be done, abolish the USA, destroy imperialism. It's very vague sloganeering that isn't connected to actual real material politics.
So in the United States, I think this is an empire that we're fighting that no movement had ever fought before, right? I think the capitalists are really smart by keeping people overworked, keeping people starved, and distracted, so they don't get into activism and advocate for communism and pro-working class policies the way they should. The mindset that many people will have is mutual aid is a way so people can get into activism and ease the brunt of capitalism while we fight for change and while we continue to advocate for socialism and social change. What do you think would be the best route forward, considering what we are fighting, considering the fact that people are overworked, people are starving, to get them on our side? Because we got activists that advocate for, I think it's a good idea to get to nationalized healthcare, like Medicare for all is a stepping point, and asking for increased wages, asking for the decreased police budgets, decreased military budgets. What do you think is the best route forward for the people who are being crushed by the system that does not have this foundation to resist? Because when you got people that try to build mutual aid organizations, it's about creating the foundation that we need to resist the U.S. empire that don't necessarily exist right now. What do you think should be the steps in order so we can properly challenge the system? Hassan, you want to take that and then I'll get back to Q?
Yeah, sure. Everything you said are great things and policies to propose. Now, in terms of like mutual aid as a strategy, any strategy is valid until it's put into practice. And once it's put into practice, you need to see, what has the result been. Now, doing mutual aid work on its own is a lot of work. So given how small the resistance to imperialism is, we need to be smart about, what work we're actually doing right now. And the most important thing I see right now is exactly what you're doing. And this is waging information war. Second most important thing for me would be to build up the party. Or at least build up a coalition of third parties and build up a coalition of a populist movement, a coalition of anti-establishment movement to break the duopoly. If, a third party, whether it's a party or it's in a anti-establishment coalition tent formation, if it can like legitimately challenge the two-party system, it will completely change the political dynamics right now. Like in my opinion, what's really crushing the political struggle is this two-party system, because there's no room for other political voices to enter. So as an example, Bernie ended up gaining a lot of support after he was scammed out of the election. What he could have done is do what Trump did: go on TV and say, "Hey, they stole the election from me." Right? That is how you challenge the two-party system.
When they literally admitted, "Hey, fuck it, our party, our rules. We can cheat if we want to."
Yeah, exactly.
Out loud. They were literally saying out. I think like especially when they had a shadow app in Iowa, I think Bernie should have sued them. Like it should have been, and they decided not to because they're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, we didn't want to seem like crybabies." Like that is
Exactly.
the perfect opportunity. But sorry, Hassan, I want you to finish your thought.
No. The point is like Bernie's movement shows that there's a thirst for like an anti-establishment candidate, and Bernie's logic was, all right, since I lost, I'll just make sure all my voters will go vote for the Democrats. But that's not what happened. A lot of people either just didn't vote or went to Trump. Because most Americans are sick and tired of the establishment parties. They're sick and tired of Hillary Clinton. They're sick and tired of Bernie, right? So Biden. After Bernie was scammed out, then a lot of them just went to Trump because Trump positioned himself as another anti-establishment politician. So the point is, it's very possible to build up that kind of anti-establishment movement, but the left needs to stop tailing the Democrats and start focusing on building the anti-establishment movement, right? Like. CPUSA is a great example. They'll always default to, all right, we need to fight the impending fascism, so we need to vote Democrats for now.
Yeah.
So how long will that go? Like, how long can you keep just saying, all right, like communists need to think, or leftists in general should need to think long term, not just short term, because every time you give up the growing kind of anti-establishment movement to the Democrats and ask them to reintegrate, one way you're doing is causing a lot of people to go to the right, because a lot of anti-establishment minded people will be sick of the anti-establishment left saying go vote for Democrats, and then they'll go find a new anti-establishment candidate, or they'll just become nihilistic and just kind of give up. So an anti-establishment movement is very easy. I think it's very buildable, especially today. I mean, like in now's time, a lot of even like right-wing populists, because the war with Russia was accelerated.
If I can just add one thing, Hassan.
Yeah, go on.
Like, I don't want to interrupt you, but
Go.
no, there's one thing I want to add to that. For people who end up becoming disaffected because people are so cynical that they think that rerouting disappointed voters back to Democrats is going to accomplish anything. I say that like behind every doomer, there's a neglected optimist, right? There's a neglected idealist. People don't become doomer because they don't care. Actually, the problem is doomers do care. That's why they end up become nihilists. They cared so much, but then there's nobody willing to acknowledge how they feel or want to take up a political cause to try and do something about it. Mm-hmm. Right? This idea that we have to act in the interests of pragmatism. People say that word a lot. Pragmatism and not cooperation or comedy, but compromise. Right? Like you can't actually get everything you want. So just give up on your principles, get with the real world where nobody's political project ever actually works. Mm-hmm. That is, to me, real nihilism. And the doomers are people that are simply politically homeless because nobody's listening to them.
Yeah.
That's well said. And something I want to pass it back to you guys, because both of you guys kind of mentioned this, and it's something that been driving me crazy, especially about the left, is I've been victim of this. I'm sure probably you guys have as well. People demonize anyone who's willing to talk to, work with conservatives. Yeah. I remember people got mad with me because I said, this was during the time we had the March for Medicare for All. I literally said, I don't care if they're a Trump supporter, I don't care if they're conservative. If you march for Medicare for All, you're on my side. I still remember like it was almost coordinated in a way, like the Red Brown Alliance. They were like, you're Red Brown Alliance for working with conservatives, right? Yep. So what do you make of this? I think it's a psyop. I think it's a push.
No, absolutely.
Man, what the fuck is a Red Brown Alliance? What is a Red Brown Alliance? What does that mean? What historical basis are we working from to talk about any kind of Red Brown Alliance? When people use the word, because people used to say, like, people would say that I'm part of the Red Brown Alliance. Me, a black man.
Anyone who's anti-imperialist, anyone who's
Yeah.
advocating for worker solidarity, they were like, "You're Red Brown lines." But sorry, go ahead, Q.
We need to cut this. Here's the thing. Okay, so if you believe that somebody who's willing to talk to people that don't agree with them politically is actually enabling people that don't agree with them politically, well, reliably, about half of U.S. voters, it's always somewhere between, in any election year, it swings between about 45 to 55% of voters, right, are going to disagree with you. They're not going to support the candidate that you support. They're not going to support the policies that you support. So somewhere, let's split the difference and say about half the country disagrees with you, right? Do you think that half the country are fascists? And if so, then why do you
They
still live
do.
in the United States?
Right? The same people.
Is it that half of the country are fascists, or is it that you have no ability to articulate your politics in such a way that anybody wants anything to do with you?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where this purist bullshit comes from. That if you talk to a conservative, you don't have to agree with any conservative or anybody else really besides a communist. Like I talk to all kinds of people that I don't agree with. I don't know. I have a lot of liberal friends, but for some reason people think that it's more acceptable for you to have a conversation with and platform a liberal than somebody who has conservative politics. Now, to me, they are different faces of capitalism. So why is it my obligation to give time and attention and energy to the polite face of capitalism?
Yes.
And then for those people who are just like, no, capitalism is what it is, and if you don't like it, go fuck yourself. You can just starve. Well, I got to talk to them too, because there's a lot of people in the country that feel that way as well. So this whole like red brown stuff is basically it's what the true nihilists do to stop any action from happening, because I don't think they're actually committed to any political project that has any chance of winning. What they actually want is to be right, but never have to prove it. Like you don't actually ever have to prove that your theory of change ever works in the real world, because you're never going to talk to anybody that's open to to different points of view. Now, do I believe that conservatives are my comrades? No. I mean, their political worldview is just as odious to me as liberals. Actually, I would say liberals more so, because they try to be nice about it. But the fact of the matter is, most people, if you really drill down into their politics, don't believe this stuff root and branch. They believe in it because they think it'll accomplish what will help them, their families, and their communities out. They cleave to the form of politics that they see as having the best benefit for themselves, their families, and their communities. Now, how are you going to build a socialist revolution and leave all of those people out? A lot of people joke about, these people are going to get the wall or the gulag or whatever. They'll roll out the guillotines. But I don't know, man. If you have family from a country that was forged by political violence, this stuff just isn't really that fucking funny, right? It's only people that stand no chance of ever engaging in violence or having violence done against them that'll say shit like that. Right, so the idea that you can just write off half of the country on a whim and say, yeah, we can never work with these people. Well, then you have, outside of just mass violence, purges, and killing fields, you don't have a political theory of change. So you better go figure out how to talk to them.
And I noticed that the people who will push the Red Brown Alliance, they're usually in deep blue areas. They live in New York. They live in the suburbs. They tend to do well. They tend to be people who do well, who push the Red Brown Alliance. Where if you talk to, there's people afraid of talking to workers. They afraid.
They hate workers.
To people. But yeah, I would love to get your thoughts on it as well, Hassan. Because as soon as I saw the Red Brown Alliance, as soon as I start seeing people use that, I immediately started going at. It made even more people upset at me, because I'm like, this is obviously bullshit. Yeah. There's no.
It's a fucking op. It's exists. And here's the thing, I don't actually care about talking to quote unquote leftists. If you start off with any political project and your intended audience are people that supposedly already exist on the left, you've lost, because nothing you do is ever going to be good enough for these people. They will, cleave onto Democrats, even though they'll complain about them, but they'll actually go out and support them. But anything that you bring up is just never going to work, or it's fascistic, or you're fraternizing with the enemy, or whatever the fuck. And really what it is it's grade school shit. In reality, a lot of these people have the same politics as anybody who painted their profile picture Liberty Green in the 2020 election. You know, they had like the blood and teeth emojis in their profile. People who have like notorious RBG T-shirts, they very much have the same politics. No, they do. They have the same politics because they have the same sort of like the wheels turn in the same direction, right? They behave the same way as these sort of like progressive liberals who are still liberals at heart. The problem with them is they can't ever actually admit to themselves that they have the same politics as their parents or their insufferable cousins or whatever the hell. So they adorn themselves in this sort of like revolutionary aesthetic. They may have read some books, or I don't know, like picked up screen caps on Twitter and then extrapolated from there. They might have surfed a little bit on Marxists.org, but have they actually synthesized communist politics? And here's how you know whether they do or not. Do you belong to a revolutionary party? Doesn't have to be CPUSA or PSL. Could be any number of organizations that have revolutionary politics. Do you belong to a party? Are you moving in a disciplined fashion? Because if you're not, then I don't give a fuck what you have to say about anything. You're just talking.
There's people in organizations. There's people in organizations and parties that still have the left brain. You know, so
this is true. But at the very least, if you're not willing to engage in organized political activity, it tells me that you're not very serious about it. And I know that CPUSA and PSL have their issues to work out, just as like parties in just about every country have to work out. But what I will say is this: is that like I'm a member of the Communist Party of Canada, right? Now, there's nothing in the party constitution, and there's never been a member of my party that has told me, hey, you shouldn't go out and talk to conservative people. You shouldn't you shouldn't share a platform with this, that, or the third person. You shouldn't work with such and such media organization. They don't do these things because they know it never actually works and has no chance of actually building political power. So it's either like you want to sit around and gripe and feel right, or you actually want to build political power. Sorry, Hassan, I feel like I took all your time. You go ahead.
No, it's all good. So Malcolm said that the right are the wolves and the liberals are the smiling foxes, right? I think that's very true. One of the big issues with the left is that they don't know who the enemy is. Like they don't see. So I mean, which group of capitalists are controlling the world right now, right? It's the neoliberals. It's the people who are dominating the Democratic Party. So what the left ends up doing is putting all the hyper focus on this like far right. Now, I think the far right, if they were to take power and overturn the neoliberals, would be a very powerful and primary enemy. But they themselves would have to kind of fight the neoliberal establishment for their own purposes, right? I'm talking about the right nationalists who, they're also anti-globalist. They want to be the monopoly power, right? They want the kind of power that the neoliberals have. So the left, rather than focusing on the people actually in power, they kind of put the focus on this fringe far right. The other thing is they don't even know anything about the enemy, right? Like most of them think the World Economic Forum, Great Reset is a conspiracy theory. Like they don't know who Klaus Schwab is. They don't know like who the big names in the finance world are besides like Bill Gates. And even Bill Gates, they kind of see as someone who's kind of doing good because he's pushing the climate change, politics, right? But they can't actually name the people in power. They can't name the organizers. They don't know the debates and ideologies that the ruling class themselves are having amongst themselves, right? As a way forward, they don't know anything about economics. Like I said before, like they can't like plan some kind of economic policy to present to the people. So for me, a big issue is naming the enemy, and I think parties end up like suffering some of this issue. Like there's multiple parties I can think of who have very disciplined and good communists as their like membership, as their like core membership, but as they've recruited young leftists and students from the cities more and more, they've had trouble espousing their own views within the party, because they don't want to get canceled by the kind of like dominant leftists now inside the membership. So I think that this kind of like leftism, the leftism that's against populism, the leftism that's against like talking to workers, the kind of left that blames COVID, for example, on workers from the South for not wearing masks or not getting vaccinated, right? Like they're very dominant right now. And they're not putting the focus on the actual enemy. the actual enemy being the dying neoliberal establishment who will do whatever it takes to maintain their power. So when fascism comes, it will come from them. And so even when I hate saying like when fascism comes, because that establishment that is in power now that they think is a lesser evil. By the way, like they'll reject lesser evilism in words, but in practice, it will still espouse lesser evilism by making sure they stop the impending fascism by voting for the Democrats. But the Democrats, the new liberal establishment right now, has been raining death upon the entire world for decades. They've been arming Nazis. Like that's that. If like what else is fascism? So like for the left, fascism is fascism only when some of that kind of violence starts coming inside their home country. That's what they don't want, right?
Yeah, I debated Destiny, and I was explaining to him, you can't call any other country fascist if you don't believe the United States is fascist. So you got a lot of these people who they claim, oh my God, I'm anti-fascist. Meanwhile, they voting for Joe Biden.
I've said this so many times.
Go ahead.
Some of the most racist motherfuckers I've ever met in my life call themselves anti-fascists. Right? So I don't believe that shit.
Hey, dude, I feel you, man. That does not surprise me one bit. And that's why one of my first go-tos whenever I see someone repeating red-brown alliance conspiracy theories is they don't even understand that there's an active blue-brown alliance. Like when you have people like Ro Khanna say they're friends with Bill Kristol. When you have Ilhan Omar saying that they're friends with Nancy Pelosi. That's the blue-brown alliance. How is that not the same exact thing that they accuse workers just for organizing of doing? Now, with that said, we got like another 10 minutes here. I want to get, because I'm curious, we got to do this again because there's a lot of things I want to talk about. But since we're talking about kind of this
I mean, listen, you feel free to have me on whenever or Hassan on
yeah,
whenever.
We got to do it again. We got, because there's so much.
It's not a one and done conversation. We're friends now, so sorry.
Yeah, for sure.
Good luck getting rid of me that easy.
I'm gonna be on your show on Thursday, right? Just do a quick plug Thursday, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so
that's right.
Well, I would love to kind of get your thoughts because you and Canada Q, because I remember during the trucker convoy, the what was coming out from the left at that time, where they were attacking the people organized there. What was your take on in general, like the American reaction, the reaction on the left in terms of the trucker convoy, and your takes on that, if you want to discuss that? I'm just curious because you're in Canada.
I thought that I don't know, people were a little bit too willing to call the trucker convoy the uprising of the working class. I never thought that. And just because I'm I have family members that drive long haul trucks, so I know the makeup of the industry. And for a lot of people that had the time and the ability to go down to Parliament Hill to protest and park their trucks there for several days, I don't know. Most of them were owner operators. I don't even really think that's all that important though, because I think what a lot of people got lost and caught up in is that they saw Nazi flags. There were people that came with biker jackets with patches that identified themselves as members of neo-Nazi organizations. There were people that came with Confederate flags. Now, all of that is true, and that's a fucking problem. Here's my issue with that, though. Was what they were protesting, was it worthwhile to protest or not? Did they actually have a point? What were they there for? Were they there to to be proud of being white supremacists? Were they there to show themselves off as Confederate supporters? Well, no, you had some people that had Nazi flags. You had some people with Confederate flags. You had people with biker jackets with patches that identified them as part of being part of neo-Nazi organizations. But anybody can join a protest, right? Now, where people were saying, well, if it was a communist protest, would these people feel comfortable showing up? Of fucking course not. Now, here's the thing. We just talked a minute ago about people who are politically homeless, right? Now, when you have reactionaries that have a theory of change and have an explanation for why the world is the way it is and the way the world is, there's something deeply wrong with it, that you're not making as much money as you used to. Your job precarity has gone through the roof. Many people that you know have been laid off from work. The cost of living is constantly going up, and government seems completely unresponsive to your pain. We've known that throughout history, whenever these downswings in economic and social mobility occur, there are always going to be reactionaries that are willing to sort of like divert populism towards hateful and reactionary politics.
Can I jump in?
But hold up. By the
Yeah.
same token, why were people there in the first place? They were there to protest the vaccine mandates. That's a bigger fucking problem, because somebody wearing a biker jacket might have the ability to do me harm if they encounter me face to face. But somebody who sits up in a government office, in a in a staffer's office somewhere, and helps to write out a policy that says, if you do not get your vaccine, your employer can fire you. And when you've been fired for a cause, we're going to describe it as for a cause. When you've been fired because you haven't gotten the vaccine, we're going to deny you employment insurance benefits. So you either get the vaccine or you fucking starve. Now, the biker wearing that patch has the ability to do me harm, but you know who that person can only do harm to people on an individual basis. When you're writing a policy that says you either do what we say or you fucking starve, you, to me, are far more dangerous than the person wearing that biker patch, because you can inflict harm on broad swaths of people and people will cheer you for it. That's what I think of the trucker convoy, is that they had a very good reason to be there. And the fact that there are so many people who claim to be on the left that were cheering on police cracking down on them, the government of Canada passing the sweeping emergency legislation that allowed the government and banks to work together to seize your assets, not only for attending the protest, but even for helping somebody who is at the protest. I'm sorry, but that to me is fascism. That's what fascism actually looks like. Not just the dude in the biker jacket.
I'll pass it right to you, Hassan. But I remember I had Howie Hawkins on the show, and he was like a big mandates guy. And I asked him, he's a big lefty, right? I was like, so you support like banning people for grocery stores, allowing them to starve if they don't get the vaccine? And he said yes. I literally asked him directly that. Now he said, yeah. I'm like, that's an insane take.
Absolutely.
So if you're on the left,
absolutely
that's
not
beyond insane. But
I don't see how you can claim to have left politics and claim that you care about people and then say some shit like that. Absolutely not.
Yeah, you can look at my interview. I literally asked him straight up. He said, yeah, I like, and then I asked him like, so if a single mom with multiple kids was fired because they didn't have vaccines, so she had no way for your kid, that wrong? Like, no, I don't care. Like, that's crazy. Yeah. I will get started. I know you want to chime in. Go ahead, Son.
Yeah, it's another issue of not knowing your enemy, right? Like, the thing is, the right wing, a lot of right wing workers despise big pharma. They despise big tech. A lot of leftists like look to both of these monopolies as saviors. When leftists think that someone has a platform that they don't like, they want big tech to censor them. When leftists, are faced with a big pandemic, they don't see a state or a people's organization as saviors. They see big pharma as saviors. And the left, with those protests, we're not seeing who the enemy is. So even if the class nature of the truckers were petty bourgeois or owner-operators, they're still like up against the monopoly, right? Like the whole slogan of the 99% against the 1%. 99% includes all kinds of people from all kinds of strata against a very small percentage of establishment. And I always look towards China as an example of this, the Chinese Revolution. When the Chinese Revolution was, the Chinese communists were in war with the KMT fascists. When the Japanese invaded China, they said to the KMT, hey, let's stop fighting, let's unite and drive out the Japanese invaders. Because the Japanese were like the primary enemy at that point. And I think communists today or leftists in general can learn from that. The leftists can kind of understand who the actual enemy is. It's the corporate establishment that's trying to establish mandates, which, and it's sad because, the protesters who were out there and the many workers who were supporting those protesters, they saw leftists supporting the state and supporting the corporate establishment. So then in their eyes, they see socialism as bad because they see American socialists defending that. But Cuba doesn't have vaccine mandates. China doesn't have vaccine mandates, right? Actual communist countries don't have vaccine mandates.
Bring that up to a progressive and watch their head explode. I used to bring that up all the time.
Oh, no, they'll try to tell you that, China has vaccine mandates because, in this, that, or the third municipality, they can't go from place to place if they don't have the vaccine passport, whatever the fuck. And I was like, but is it a federal policy, right? This is a municipal level decision. is it a federal policy in China that you must have the vaccine? As a matter of fact, not only is the answer no, but the central committees were asking for municipalities to stop doing that shit. People need to be able to trust their government and get the vaccines willingly. This was a national debate that was happening in China, and you would know this if you actually read Chinese news sources. And the federal government was on the side of letting individuals decide.
Yeah, exactly. And, a day after the trucker protests, leftists went out to counter-protest. Many communists, I saw the Communist Party flag out in the protests, counter-protesting the protesters. So, for me, the people were mad about something.
Hold up. You want to be clear about one thing. They were counter-protesting because a lot of these people were targeting nurses and doctors. So the reason that they showed up to the Toronto protest,
but the message in the end is that these protests are bad and we should support the vaccines and vaccine mandates.
No, it was that we should support nurses.
In practice, if you're counter-protesting an anti-vaccine, an anti-mandate protest, you end up supporting mandates. That's the practice. So the thing is, why were the petty bourgeois at the forefront of this kind of discontent with the mandates, right? Because many workers are discontent with the mandates. Why are the petty bourgeois at the forefront of this? Why aren't the communists at the forefront of this? Why aren't leftists at the forefront? If the leftists and communists are so connected to the masses and they represent workers, why aren't they at the forefront leading them? Why do they leave this vacuum for maybe fascistic tendencies, which were there, absolutely, fascistic tendencies or petty bourgeois tendencies to take the lead? And that's the point. So what actually ends up happening is there's a vacuum. People are discontent. No one's giving them political direction. So right-wing forces come in. And then rather than left-wing forces vying to show people political direction, they end up siding with the establishment and saying, oh, these guys are fascists, they're anti-vaxxers. They weren't anti-vax, they were just anti-mandate, right? They attacked them, they claim Red-Brown Alliance, right? And at the final, what is the final result? More and more workers dislike leftists. More and more workers associate socialism with the establishment and liberals. More and more workers see socialists as defenders of big pharma or big tech or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. And this is actually the last thing I want to talk about because this is something I want to circle back because Q mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to discuss this when we first started the conversation about the propaganda about China. And I want to talk to you guys about the new Cold War and specifically the claims of Uyghur genocide. And the thing, we got to make sure we get this correct, right? Because
this nigga, of course you want to make that the last topic.
No, because I wanted to talk about this a little bit more because
we could be here for an hour.
Correct me if I'm wrong, right? Because I heard the life expectancy of the Uyghur population went up during this supposed genocide, and now what I tell liberals is the life expectancy of Black Americans has fallen in the United States for decades now. So if anyone has a claim that there was a genocide done to our people, wouldn't it be the people whose life expectancy actually fell? Anyway, I would love to get. I want to ask you about that. We can start with Q and Hassan. What do you think is the biggest? I'm gonna frame the question like this. What do you think is the biggest misconception, and what do you think how they got away with the lie about the?
Here's what I always ask people to do, is tell me where you got the number of Uyghurs supposedly detained in concentration camps, and they always use concentration camps. That's what they always say, concentration camps. Tell me where you got the number from. It started at almost 1 million, then it was 1 million, then it was 1.5 million, then it was 3 million, then it was 6 million, then it was more Uyghurs detained than Jewish people were detained during the Holocaust in concentration camps. And then a Washington Post article, this one was fucking amazing. They said up to 1 million or more, which basically encapsulates all the numbers conceivable, right? They can never actually tell you a number, and the reason that they can't is because the way that they got the number in the first place, and this is actually this was the contradiction. This was the part of the story that began to break down for me and why I started looking into it myself. And this is back around 2014, 15. China Human Rights Defenders, which is an organization that spun off from Radio Free Asia, I believe. in itself was a State Department project. They went to various villages around, I believe it was, okay, I'm gonna have to go back and look this up because I don't want to get the wrong region, but they went into rural areas in like outside of like the Xinjiang capital, and they would ask villagers, hey, how many people would you say have disappeared or that you know have been detained by the Chinese government? And they would say 200 people. And so they would say, okay, so if 200 people, that's what the villagers say are missing from their village, have been detained, and this village is 5,000 people. Well, that tells us that X percent of the village has been detained, right? So here's the problem with that. Do you know 200 people, Nick? Like in your neighborhood?
Like, do I know them? Not really.
Okay, do you know 200 people enough to if 200 people in your neighborhood disappeared over the course of like a year, would you know them well enough to be like, oh yeah, man, I haven't seen so and so around in a minute, right? No, I'm being 100% serious right now because this is how they arrived at these numbers. Do you know enough people in your neighborhood that if you didn't see them over the course of a year, you'd think, wow, something's up. They must be missing. No, most people don't. We only have so many people in our immediate social circle that we would be able to mentally keep track of. Okay, so what they did was go to rural villages and ask people, hey, how many people do you think are missing? And then from there, extrapolate, okay, so X percentage of this rural population in this village are missing. And then they extrapolated that to, well, there are X amount of rural villages in this particular area of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So therefore, if you were to round that up to the entire region as a whole, this is how many people are missing. This is how many people, therefore, must have been detained. And then the number they came up with was somewhere around 670,000 people. Now, they didn't say all 670,000 people were in concentration camps, as it were. They actually differentiated between the two. There were the prison-like detention facilities, and there were also vocational training centers. So about half were in the vocational training centers, half were in the prison facilities or prison-like facilities.
I don't even think it's half. I think it's a very large majority were at the vocational centers.
I mean, but it hardly matters. I know it was over 300,000 that were at the vocational training centers, but I don't think at this point it hardly matters because here's why it doesn't make any fucking difference whatsoever. The methodology in the first place was fucked. That is not methodology. If you were to bring that to your 101 stats class, your professor would laugh you out of the class, and yet they rounded it up, put it in a human rights report, and people reported it uncritically in mainstream newspapers as if it was fact, like it was verifiable, and it wasn't. And then Adrian Zenz took that report that China human rights defenders produced and said, I actually think the number is closer to 1 million. How do you know it's closer to 1 million? I just have a hunch. I know something about the region. I'll say it's closer to 1 million. And then newspapers went ahead with what he said and said, oh, it's actually, scholars say up to 1 million may be missing. And then he would continually round the number up. And these news organizations backed by academic institutions that were themselves being funded by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, National Endowment for Democracy, and any number of other federal institutions were producing these reports based on these false and fake numbers that continually got rounded up on about a 1 to 2 year basis to the point where we got them saying there are more people in concentration camps in Xinjiang than there were Jewish people rounded up during the Holocaust. Now explain to me, does this sound like a concentration camp to you, Nick? I'm going to describe something to you. You tell me whether or not it sounds like a concentration camp. So you wake up at home in the morning, right? So you wake up at home, you brush your teeth, you eat breakfast, you get dressed, and you go to a facility. In this facility, you sit and you learn things like electrical engineering or electronics per se. You learn how to you know how to use like an ohm meter. You know the difference between like a resistor and a capacitor. You can put together a circuit board. you can build things now, right? Or you learn how to cross stitch, right? You know how to like sew and weave. You know how to repair fabrics. Or you learn how to manage people. You learn how to work within teams and manage groups of people so that they can get tasks accomplished. So you're learning this for about 3 to 3.5 hours, and then you get a break. During this break, you can leave the premises, go home and eat lunch, or pray, or whatever it is that you have to do, and then you come back for the remaining 3.5 hours, and at the end of that learning day, you go back home again to your family. Now, Nick, does that sound like a concentration camp to you?
I didn't know college was a concentration camp.
Well, we should contextualize the vocational centers.
Hold up. I just want to. I need to get through this.
I'll give you next, Hassan. I'll give you next. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I need to get through this because this is the basis upon which people are building the case that genocide was taking place. I've just described to you what the vocational training centers were like. Now, people would say, well, do you have a choice as to whether you go to the vocational training centers? And I say, well, they probably didn't, but I don't fucking care. That's not my business. I don't live in that country. Those aren't my standards. Does a 15 or 16-year-old have a choice as to whether they can go to, like, whether they have to go to school or not? Of course they don't. They go to school. So if you round that up to, let's say, an adult, and they say, hey, you adults have to go to this vocational training center. I mean, it may not make sense to me, but am I going to call that a blow against human rights? No. It's just not. I'm not going to impose my values on anybody else like that. But here's the problem, though. When those people who went to the vocational training centers ended up getting jobs outside of Xinjiang, mind you, and this is where they talked about forced population transfer. So let's say there aren't that many jobs available in like Kashgar, let's say, or Urumqi or wherever. Let's say the job is available in Shenzhen or Guangzhou. You go there, you work for an electronics fabricating facility, you're paid a fairly good wage, at least a good enough wage that not only can you cover your cost of living in the city that you're in, but you can also send money back home and people can pay their rents or their mortgages. They can cover the children's bill, they can cover the costs of living and education and everything like that. Would you say that that is a forced population transfer, that you went outside of your hometown to go find a job elsewhere? No. You know why you wouldn't say that? Because when in Alberta, Canada, there was an oil boom and people were leaving from Ontario and Quebec and Halifax, Nova Scotia to go to Fort McMurray because that's where the oil jobs were. That's not forced population transfer. You just went where the jobs were. But according to organizations like the ones that Adrian Zenz works for, according to Bellingcat, according to the State Department, and all of this is coming from Marco Rubio's office, mind you. This is where all of this information is being propagated from. That's forced population transfer. And then finally, last thing I'm going to say, and Hassan, like, take it away. When you tell companies that this is forced labor, the labor, by the way, that people are getting paid very handsomely for, that they can not only take care of their own cost of living for wherever they are living, but also send money to family back home to take care of their family back home, and they can travel freely back and forth, okay? When you tell companies, hey, the people that are working for you, did you know that they're Uyghur people? Do you know what kind of conditions that Uyghur people have to go through? You should be ashamed of yourself that you're employing Uyghur people because they're being, now, mind you, the factories that they work at, like, we're not forcing anybody to work here. I mean, they can leave whenever they want. They don't fucking have to work here. They asked us to work here, and our government told us, hey, if you don't hire X amount of Uyghur people, we're going to consider it job discrimination, and you may find yourselves in a lot of hot water. You should be hiring every ethnic group that's applying. Don't just hire people that you're comfortable with. Hire everybody that's applying. So it's like we were told to hire them because we were asked to be more diverse. As a matter of fact, back in the early 2000s, around 2008, 2009, you yourselves in the United States were yelling at us because we weren't employing enough Uyghur people. And you thought that we needed to instill some form of affirmative action, just like you did in the United States, so that we could keep our import-exports healthy. And now you want to come back and tell us that we should fucking fire these people? Nah, we'll take a pass on that. Which is, okay, so when companies like Sony, Philips, Samsung, LG, etc., find themselves under the prospect of having either tariffs levied against them or having negative consumer responses because the subcontractors that provide the parts, like that fabricate the parts that are put together into the finished electronic products that these companies sell with their brand name on it, people are saying to them, well, you're using forced Uyghur labor in your supply chain. How fucking dare you? Now, do you think these companies have more of an obligation to Uyghur people or to their shareholders to provide maximal value? Which means if you have to get rid of warehouses that have Uyghur employees at all, yeah, sure, you're going to go ahead and do that. Nick, do you think that they're going to have more obligation to the Uyghur people or to their shareholders? You tell me. Probably to the shareholders, right?
Yeah, shareholders.
Okay, so that's the final step in this process is to kick Uyghur people to remove them from the labor supply chain, to make them unemployable. What happens when there's a group of people, an ethnic minority, that is concentrated in a particular region that are out of work, nearly unemployable, and cannot assimilate into the broader culture because if they do, it's called cultural genocide. What usually happens as a result, Nick? Throughout history, when you've had like a group of ethnic minorities that are concentrated to a particular region, not allowed to assimilate socially or economically, what usually happens?
They're displaced. They're confused, right? Go ahead.
Or they want to separate, and violently so. They'll commit acts of violence. They may find themselves under the sway of fundamentalists that are brought in from like nearby regions. They end up becoming like a rebellious population. And then, of course, what happens when the U.S. finds itself with a minority population that wants to break away from a country that the U.S. considers an enemy? What usually happens?
You get terrorism.
Pretty much. And the United States is all too happy to take what can be described as terrorism to most people that are under the, at the effect of it, arm them, and then let the chips fall where they may, which is pretty much what happened in Ukraine. So the long story short is that this has been a continual process to drive a socioeconomic wedge and drive a cultural wedge between the broader Chinese population and Uyghur people. Now, what I left out was the Wahhabist fundamentalists from areas like Afghanistan and, people who've come in from Turkey, from Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan, etc. I've left all of that out. I don't think we have to go into all of those details. But the long and short of this is when you say that there is a genocide happening in Xinjiang, what you're actually doing is helping the United States along in this project to try and drive a socioeconomic and a cultural wedge between Uyghur people and the rest of China to splinter them off from China. Why? For the purpose of making sure that all of the abundant oil resources, not only in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but also in Central Asia, are not accessible to China and thus accessible to the United States and its partners. That's what you're doing.
Well said. I'm going to get Hassan in here as well. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to contextualize the vocational schools first of all. This Jelly Jam in the chat actually makes a good point. He says, so was the U.S. right with sending Native kids to vocational schools? So I actually want to contextualize the vocational school, and I think it's actually important to talk about the fundamentalism. So some history, before the revolution in China, China was an extremely backwards country. When I say backwards, I'm talking about after the fall of the Qing dynasty, basically anarchy appears throughout the entire country. Warlords take control of regions. People are living under very oppressive slavery, feudal systems under the warlords. So there's a very backwards development of the country compared to where China was historically. Now, the point of the Chinese Revolution is to develop the country, and careful attention is paid to the rural regions because those regions are some of the hardest to develop, especially because they're agricultural centers. Now, Xinjiang is a unique kind of geography. First of all, it's very isolated compared to the rest of the mainland population because it's the most west. It's largely desert, and historically, the population there has been nomadic, where in other parts of the China, the population has been not nomadic, but more agricultural and not pastoral, right? So China's development has not been even. Some parts of the countries have developed faster than others, and some parts of the country haven't. Xinjiang has been one of the regions that has been most late towards development. So the Chinese Communist Party has put a lot of effort in recently, or when I say recently, over the last decade, to start developing it because of some of what started happening due to the lack of development, and that is the entry of fundamentalism. Now, geographically, Xinjiang is in a region of the world, Central Asia, that is very important to global geopolitics. Historically, the Silk Road, which was a trade route that connected China, Persia, and India and Africa all together, went right through Central Asia. Afghanistan, for example, is another really important country to have control over, and this is why the U.S. is so after destabilizing the Iranian government. So Xinjiang is also an important region. The U.S. government has used Islamic fundamentalism to try to have control over Central Asia. The Chechen wars are a good example of that, right? Islamic fundamentalism was brewed in Chechnya to destabilize that region as well. And Xinjiang is no different. But the thing with Xinjiang is that it's a lot easier. The people are nomadic. People are families move, not like a family doesn't just permanently settle down one spot. There's less jobs, there's more poverty, there's less education. So fundamentalism was very easy to target in that region. That led to terrorist attacks in Xinjiang that the state had to deal with. Now, unlike the US, the state didn't deal with it by throwing them into Guantanamo Bay forever. Economic development is the primary way they deal with it. So the vocational schools were developed as a way to integrate a lot of the nomadic people into the economy. So the rule was that, so traditionally, many of the nomadic people didn't want to go, but the state says, all right, you can stay, but your children have to go. And then from now on, right? So some kind of schooling system was put forward. And that applies here too. Every child has to go to school. You don't have the option to just skip education and skip learning languages. So in terms of jobs, the economy in Xinjiang is largely agricultural. So in order to expand job opportunities, they started teaching Mandarin in a vocational school. So younger kids can learn Mandarin and then go find jobs elsewhere if they don't want to be part of the agricultural economy. And the thing is, the workers who are already part of the agricultural economy were not the nomadic people because there were already settled people inside that region. Nomadic people, again, were largely pastoral. So there's that history there. Now, if you want to compare it to vocational schools in US, I would even call it vocational schools. American schools that native populations were forced into, first of all, were forced to undergo conversion, were banned from speaking their languages, had their hair cut, had their traditions wiped. None of this is enforced on ethnic minorities in China. In fact, the state has a very large role in expanding the cultures of ethnic minorities. For example, ethnic dances and music styles and art is taught in mainland China across the country in order to make sure that their ethnic cultures can spread across the country and develop further. They're not banned from speaking their languages. They're just taught other languages, right, to be bilingual. There's no erasure of religion. There's no forced conversions. It's literally economic development through education. And so in terms of religion, the one thing that is combated is Islamic fundamentalism, which does not represent the population of Xinjiang, right? Uyghur Muslims are not historically extremists. As an example, many Uyghur Muslims drink.
Well, Wahhabism is not it's not part of any culture, right? Wahhabist fundamentalism does not come from Xinjiang, and it's not part of Uyghur culture, just as it's not part of Islamic culture at all.
Well, it's part of the bourgeois culture of the people who are currently occupying Saudi Arabia. But what I was going to say is, Islam across the world is very varied. For example, where I'm from in Pakistan, not everyone wears a hijab. There's a lot of women who don't wear a hijab. In Xinjiang, a lot of people don't drink alcohol, right? Islam is different across the region. And you can argue that Islam in China is a lot more progressive than other areas. But one of the first propaganda pieces I saw when all this stuff was starting. This is before, it got hot with the propaganda. Was this like video of a granny like taking a shot and like having fun, and the video was like grandma is forced to drink alcohol. I'm like, dude, she's literally like in there smiling, like having fun, taking a shot, and it's like not out of the ordinary that some Muslims in some parts of the world would drink alcohol, or some Muslims in some parts of the world would not wear hijab, for example, right? It varies depending on the culture.
The funniest one was in the Washington Post, where I get the author or the writer went to, I believe it was Orm Tree that they were in, and saw young people flirting with each other, and took that as they've been culturally assimilated into Chinese culture, because Muslims would never like flirt openly in the street.
The extremists in Xinjiang were really aggressive. For example, they would be mad if there is a bar in the vicinity of a mosque, and they would then paint the Chinese culture as a reaction to Islam, and they wanted to challenge it. And the Wahhabists were like really pushing those kinds of ideas that the Chinese culture is an affront to Islam, and we have to fight against it. And this is how a lot of them are getting radicalized. Now, again, the way China dealt with the radicalization was through like rehabilitative justice, and also like for those who had already been caught in the process of radicalization, but also the preventative measure of economically developing the country to make sure everyone has jobs, everyone is literate, everyone has an education, and everyone has the kind of equal opportunity that other people don't. And the other thing with this is like a minor point, but the population of Xinjiang has grown. And even the one-child policy that was in place in China did not apply to ethnic minorities, right?
Imagine a genocide where the population increased.
Right, exactly.
Well, you want to be really careful about that one, because it's the same thing that like Israelis would say about Palestinians. Oh, well, their population's increased, so
that's fair.
But here's the difference, though. Here's the difference. You might have heard that Israel was forcibly sterilizing, for example, like Ethiopians, by putting them on the Depo-Provera shot without their knowledge, right? Or I'm not sure if you had heard about that one, Nick. So Jewish people that came from Ethiopia were, without their knowledge, being sterilized by being injected with Depo-Provera.
Yeah, I did hear that.
So here's the thing. China used to have the one-child policy, which eventually gave way to a two-child policy, I think around 2015, and then now there's a three-child policy, right? And generally, like, it's fairly lax. There's no strict enforcement of it. Now, like, the new policy as of 2021 is three-child, technically, but there isn't like an enforcement mechanism anymore. So China has now reached the level of development where it can sustain rapid growth in the population.
They want rapid growth. They want like more growth.
Yeah. Right. But it had to, like, the country had to reach a level of development, the ability to like catch up infrastructurally, and to build out rapidly enough that if there was a growth in the population, the country wouldn't crash. Now, this wasn't the case in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. However, people in rural areas were exempt from the one-child policy, especially if you're an ethnic minority. So if you were, let's say, Han people and you lived in Kashgar, you could have not one but two children. However, if you were part of the Uyghur minority living in Xinjiang, nobody was actually going to enforce this one-child policy on you because ethnic minorities were exempt. However, 2015, there was a two-child policy put into place. However, if you were living in a rural area and part of an ethnic minority, you would actually be able to have one more. So you'd be able to have three when everyone else could have two. And now everyone can have three, and it's not generally being enforced. The way that they would be able to institute the one-child policy and even the two-child policy in these regions was by introducing them to family planning. So if people were having 3 children or 4 children after the two-child policy was put into effect, knowing that the policy was, hey, you can only really have 3 children. Sorry, it was a universal two-child policy. with the exemption for people living out in rural areas, then they would ask you to go visit a doctor, have a conversation about family planning. They would actually educate people about how safe family planning was, that it doesn't actually go against religion, that this is what's necessary for the good of the country, because overpopulation means we'll have to make some very difficult decisions. And if you would like to go ahead and have an IUD placed, this is the process to go ahead and get that done. They weren't giving women forced hysterectomies or tubal ligations. They were placing IUDs. Now, think about the fact that a right-wing Christian zealot like Adrian Zenz, who is anti-abortion, is saying that there's a genocide being committed against Uyghur people because Chinese doctors are giving Uyghur women access to IUDs. Tell me if that makes any fucking sense.
I knew something was up when I saw Israel was complaining about China's treatment of Muslims. How hilarious is that?
Now, and here's the other part too. Some of the oldest mosques in the world are in China. Like, people have this idea that Chinese are, they're trying to like de-Islamize or trying to eradicate the Muslim faith in China. Except, okay, if you know nothing about China whatsoever, that might make some sense. But then the question is, okay, so what about the Hui people? The largest Muslim population in China are not Uyghur people. They're Hui Chinese.
And they're so progressive that their imams can also be women. And NPR had wrote glowingly about Muslims inside China before the propaganda started, citing the Hui people.
And in the United States, which is famously great with treating Muslims, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same thing as pinkwashing, right?
Yeah,
it's the same shit where, yeah. Sorry, go
they
ahead.
also don't understand the concept of a multinational country, like a country in which different ethnic groups can live harmoniously together under one national identity. Like, Americans like to see the world being broken up into like little ethnic states, like ruled by only one ethnic group. This is why they don't understand Russia, they don't understand China, they don't understand India or Iran. They want all of these like places to be broken up by ethnic groups, even Syria, right? Like, they put all this focus on the Kurds, saying, all right, Kurds aren't Syrian, even though many Kurds will identify as Syrian. Kurds must have their own country, so we must break up Syria into smaller ethnic groups.
And yeah, create a Kurdistan. Yeah.
Right. And we can have these conversations all day. Like, our next one, we gotta talk about Marxist Leninism, because I want to do a panel on Marxism. I think you guys would be great for that. But we gotta say that for next time. We went a little bit long, but that's my fault for asking about such a complicated question as the last one. But we definitely got to do it again here soon. We about 4 hours. And yeah, this is almost officially a 4-hour stream, guys. Beast mode out here. So we got RBN live tomorrow. Also have Margaret Kimberly that's coming on tomorrow. But before we sign off, anything that you want to plug, we start with Q and then go sign. Anything else that you guys want to wrap up the conversation with, or anything that you guys want to promote as well?
Yeah, watch theculture.tv. Okay, we're on Twitch at the Kulture Live, Culture with a K, and you can catch our streams as well as the number of podcasts that we got coming out. I mean, if you like us, we also have a call-in, just like Nick's got the call-in show. We also have a call-in. It's on Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern time. Yeah, if you like us, drop by, support us, watch our streams, listen to our show.
Yeah, definitely check them out, Hassan.
Yeah, Sam, I'm a co-host with Q on The Culture. So that if you're looking for more media content like this, streaming content, check out The Culture. I also write on Substack. You can find me on my name, Hassan, 1949.substack.com.
Yeah, make sure you guys check them out. It was a very fun conversation. Like you said, Q, we got to do it again here very soon. We got a lot of stuff to cover. So thank you guys for watching. This was a long stream. Big props to anyone who sat through the whole thing. So hope you guys have a